Good morning, everyone. This next session will be in English. We apologize, but we have many speakers and guests from abroad. My name is Marina Niforos. I'm the founder and president of the Climate Governance Initiative Greece, a corporate governance organization, one of 30 chapters around the world, operating under the aegis of the World Economic Forum in order to promote a strong voice for climate action from the boardroom. With us today, we have a very esteemed panel of speakers, which it is my honor to introduce today. I will go immediately to my right, Mrs. Maya Hennerkes, who is Director for Green Financial Systems, Climate Strategy and Delivery at the EBRD. Madame Sylvie Goulard, who is former Deputy Governor for the Bank of France, MEP, Minister of Defense, and I'm going to stop there because we're going to run out of time for the panel. Mr. Leonidas Canellopoulos, Chief Sustainability Officer and member of the board for Titan Group. Mrs. Katya Gratcheva, who is Climate Advisor for the International Monetary Fund. And Mrs. Konstantina Galli, who is partner with EY for tax systems and services. So the theme we have for today, which we would like to analyze with your participation. So I encourage you, please, if you have questions or you want comments, feel free to interrupt us and jump in so we can make this a little bit more interactive. We have been talking a lot around the world about effective climate governance and underlining the fact that we need more collaboration between the public and the private spheres if we're going to have some kind of impact. So here today we're to contrast some of these perspectives from different stakeholders. And I would like to pass perhaps the floor first to Katya. So Katya, at the IMF, you have been leading some research on how we can actually bridge this gap, this purported gap in investment required in order for us to actually meet our ambitious targets for climate action. If I recall correctly, but please correct me if I'm wrong, we need about $2 trillion a year of investment by 2030, particularly in the emerging markets, and about 80 to 90% of that is supposed to come from the private sector. So what can we do to bridge this gap?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's great to listen to all these rich conversations. I would like to state that I'm presenting my personal views, not those of the IMF. And thanks for the question. I think it's important to bring a global perspective to this discussion. I think in the previous panel, we've heard about convergence of narratives about climate change, but when we analyzed a global climate action, we see very different narratives around climate in US, in Europe, and emerging economies. And yes, you're right, it's $2 trillion of investments that will need to take place in emerging markets, and this is on top of other trillions that will have to take place in advanced economies. Why emerging markets? While the narrative in the European Union is on reduction of climate emissions, in emerging markets it is on economic development. The focus is on economic development that requires significant consumption of energy. In fact, if you will see the statistics, this year the world has consumed about 1.2 million barrels a day more than last year. So the emissions are increasing, the energy production is increasing, and that's a very important consideration within the global context. So the narrative is very region-specific. Why in emerging market countries? The emerging markets, given the context, will be responsible for 2/3 of emissions going forward. And this requires the significant energy investment for realigning the energy systems that is currently not happening. There is a number of different reasons why this is not happening, and the reason we're discussing this in here is 80% to 90% will have to come from the private sector. And while the stock of capital in the private sector is hundreds of trillions of dollars, it's not flowing to the sectors that are required to have significant impact on emissions and significant impact on realigning energy systems. And this is where public and private governance will need to come into closer collaboration, and we will talk more about it in the panel.
Thank you, Katya. So I'm going to turn now to you, Maya. So Maya, you represent an institutional investor and a multilateral, and you do most of your direct lending, 3/4 of it, to the private sector. So how can we actually do this difficult conundrum that Katya is saying? How can we channel more capital to the green transition of companies?
Yeah, thanks, Marina. It's great to be here, by the way. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, so I guess we sit really at the nexus of the public and the private sectors. We finance, as you said, mainly the private sector, and we finance 50% of that is green. So last year, 2023, 6.5 billion euros were green, fully green finance. That's, as I said, 50% of our overall new funding last year, and in Greece the percentage is a bit higher than half. And yeah, we do this through our investments, but again, of course, because it's so closely interlinked, we also do that through policy engagements with governments. What we've realized is that, especially in the sustainability, ESG, green area, we can be much more impactful if we don't only focus on our use of proceeds. We've been doing this for 30 years, environmental social policies, green use of green eligibility criteria, etc. We know how to do this very well. But we also realized, actually, if we work with the companies or with financial institutions at the counterparty level and we help them transform, then obviously the impact is much larger. And we're doing this right now a lot through our engagement with companies on climate governance, our common theme here. So we support, we have an MOU with the Climate Governance Initiative, so we support different chapters, including, of course, your own here in Greece. And we do this because we really realize this allows us to work with the counterparties, not just sort of with our very narrow funding lens. And we know that when companies, when FIs start looking at their climate corporate governance, they start thinking much more strategically about this. Currently, very often that translates into transition planning, proper planning of the transformation that needs to happen. We see that they first start thinking actually about their own governance. The board needs to look much more closely at climate issues, environmental performance data, but also what's the role of the different parts of the business, audit, legal, business development, everybody has a role to play. We then see that the policies will change, they will shift, so we see an emergence of much better and much more ESG policies, fossil fuel policies. We then see companies, financial institutions measuring what they're doing, their own emissions, their financed emissions if it's a financial institution, and then set targets for it. So yeah, that's the way it goes. So I think the governance is sort of the backbone to all of this.
We definitely agree on that. So we've heard about the pressing needs in the emerging markets from both you and Katya. Sylvie, Europe. So Europe is often held as a role model in being quite active and dynamic, particularly on the regulatory level, in stimulating more action. What can we learn from the European experience, both good and perhaps things that we need to do that we haven't done so well?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. Well, I fully agree with what was said before. It is global, so Europe can be part of the solution, but we should never pretend we are the solution. The efforts made on the regulatory side, above all with the CSRD rules, for example, are going to give us data, lots of data, to know better where we are. And here I would like to make one point, which is that we should not look at climate only. We should also take into consideration, which by the way is what the CSRD is foreseeing, we need to look at the nature-related risks, the biodiversity loss, which is impacting value chains of many companies, in textile, in agri-food, etc. So Europe can contribute. Some rules elsewhere, like in California as well, play a role. And there is always an extraterritorial element because companies that want to make business in Europe, let's say Japanese companies or American ones, will be obliged to comply. But we are at the beginning of the journey. We should not pretend everything is fine. We need also to keep the rules simple. And my very last point, because I'm always puzzled when I hear addition of billions, where are the people in this? Where are the people involved in the dynamic? It can be in the companies because of what you said on the boards, the role of the different departments of a company. It's a legal issue, it's an HR issue, etc. But we should not forget that we can have the best rules, the most precise data, if there is a pushback in the population, if we don't convince our population to enter in a change which is not an easy one, then we cannot pretend to be a role model. And to be honest, what we observe right now at the global level, but also at the European level, is not entirely reassuring.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvie. We don't often associate tax policy with green. So, Konstantina, can you please share with us how can actually tax policy become a part of the toolkit of a corporate in terms of advancing their own greening strategy?
Thank you, Marina. A powerful tool for governments and for corporations as well. It is indeed a valuable, taxation is indeed a valuable policy tool in all areas, and in climate governance specifically as well, it is valuable. To frame the issue, it is in the context of climate governance that we need to identify priorities from a green tax perspective, identify the appropriate measures, but taking into account the business perspective, as well as the impact on the broader economy and the particularities of each country. By way of an example, we are working now on a project which is funded by the EU with the self-explanatory title, Greening Taxes in Greece. It is led by EY, and it is executed in collaboration with the Institute for European Environmental Policy, based in Brussels, and the Foundation for Industrial and Economic Research, IOVE in Greek. The concept is simple. It can be described as follows. We will conclude on policy recommendations which will be modeled not in terms of public revenue, because this is just an element, but in terms of the broader impact in the economy, employment, household income, or the GDP itself. So it's, in a way, it's an organized effort for the Ministry of Finance to proceed to a reform and decision-making on the green tax policy area based on information and based on calculation of the impact at an early stage, ex ante. And this is always a good start for any reform.
Thank you, Konstantina. So policy can be an important lever, both negative and positive. So as a representative and the only one on the panel for the private sector, Leonidas, we heard that people is what make change, not necessarily grand principles or even policy. So as a company that's committed to decarbonization, from your own sort of in the trenches perspective, what are some of the challenges that you face and you think they're obstacles for not only your company, obviously, but your industry, which is a heavy, challenged industry, to be able to move the ledger and onboard others as well in your chain?
Thank you, Marina. I will speak through the perspective of Titan and the cement industry, but I believe several of the insights apply to all hard-to-abate sectors. Now, Titan, as many other cement companies, has committed to reduce its CO2 emissions in line with the latest climate science and the most ambitious climate scenario, which is that of maintaining the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this is not just an ambition. It is backed by a series of actions, a roadmap of over 100 different initiatives across our geographies, across the value chain, to decarbonize our operations and products. We will be channeling a third of our capex towards these initiatives. We have already secured over 100 million tons of critical raw materials that will enable us to develop the next generation of green products. And we have secured a grant of over 200 million euro from the EU Innovation Fund to build what we believe will be the largest of its kind carbon capture unit in the cement industry in Europe. But this is only the beginning. This will only take us up to a level, and if we really want to get to net zero, not just as a company, but as a sector, as an industry, there's a lot more that has to be done. And this, unfortunately, has to do with big investments in carbon capture, which right now is the only relatively advanced, mature technology that can fully decarbonize the industry. Now, this comes, unfortunately, with a number of challenges, starting with uncertainty in terms of technology. These are emerging technologies which are only now being piloted at an industrial scale, so the technological risk is huge. The costs associated with carbon capture are immense, whether we're talking about CapEx or OpEx. It's simple to run an existing cement plant or even to build a new one without carbon capture, but retrofitting a plant with carbon capture is something very expensive. And then we also don't have the regulatory maturity that is required. This is a whole new industry, new value chain. A lot of things are unclear, and we don't have a credible signal in terms of the carbon price in the future. And in order to make these investments, you need to be able to predict what's going to happen in terms of the CO2 price. And of course, we lack infrastructure. It's not enough to just capture the CO2. You need to be able to transport it and store it permanently, and especially in the south of Europe, this is a very big problem. And we also lack demand for green products. A green premium would go a long way to help these investments happen. And going back to people, people are very important. In terms of capabilities inside the companies, these are complex projects that require a lot of capabilities. And in terms of having the local communities in line as well, supporting these projects to go ahead. So we have a lot of ambition, but a long way to go.
Thank you, Leonidas, and I think that opens the sequitur for going to a more practical second round where I'd like all of you to contribute, which is no single company, perhaps not even a single sector, can do it alone. There's several stakeholders that need each to do their part, and sometimes we seem to be talking at cross purposes or expecting one to act before the other, and no action finally takes place. So I will pass again now to Katya. So Katya, you're not exactly in direct lending or in a direct, let's say, engagement capacity with the private sector, but you're an important part of the global governance ecosystem. What do you think should multilaterals be doing in order to stimulate, put the proper incentives in place so that all that capital that is either in private equity or in other areas, the public markets, can actually start becoming much more attuned to the needs, like we heard for companies like Titan and others who are committed, have the will, but don't seem to actually be able to find the matchmaking in the markets to the level that's required?
Well, as we heard, level is significant, and we still have a significant road to travel. I would like to correct you a little bit, because IMF has evolved significantly, and a year and a half ago, we introduced Resilience and Sustainability Trust, where we lend as a fiscal space for climate action, for policy reforms, and for catalyzing private capital as well. It's not at the level of the project, at the level of the fiscal space, but that creates room for countries to think of policies that are required. But to come back to your question on what's needed, and I think to a lot of points that have been said in the panel, speak to the need for structural reforms and financial policies. A lot has started to be happening, and we've heard in other panels today on regulation and on disclosures. This is necessary but not sufficient. And I also would like to echo Sylvie's point on where are the people in this equation. What we see is, and we've surveyed extensively both private and public sector in the last year as we were deploying IMF resources, there is quite a perception gap between public sector understanding the needs of the private sector and vice versa. And we see, as you said, those sectors talk cross purposes, cross each other, and it does create missed opportunities. So we do need to bridge this perception gap. There is a lot of discussion on de-risking. I think we want to reframe that conversation to not to de-risking, but redistribution of risk, because public sector cannot bear all the private sector risk. It needs to be redistributed in a way where the global system can absorb it. And I think that conversation is still very early in its phase. And the people, I think, is such an important part of the equation. We still probably don't have full support across all the different segments of the society. And I even want to mention an example. When we would talk to, let's say, private sector or public sector, within the same institution, you could see people with very different views on what needs to happen in terms of climate action. And those who are engaged in ESG policies, they would be more forward-leaning in terms of what the company would be doing, versus those who execute are a lot more holding back. And that creates a lot of friction in the system, a lot of policy uncertainty, and that does increase the cost and slows down the action. So there is a lot more clarity that needs to happen, a lot more precise regulatory signaling for private sector, so that this can lead to more specific actions by both public and private sector.
Thank you, Katya. And so how is the EBRD addressing this? Because you're also working directly with companies. How do we see these challenges about blended finance, perhaps, or the de-risking aspects? How do you actually proportion the risks in the projects that you do? And do you have specific toolkits, specific policy instruments that you use?
Yeah, so, I mean, the hurdles are, there's many, of course. Some are indeed related to the risk structure, so well-known instruments like blended finance, of course, we use to try and de-risk. Some of it is more related to perceived risks or perceived challenges, so we're trying to address that. Then, of course, a lot of knowledge can be sort of passed on the back of specific financing instruments. But maybe just to tie this bit back to our focus here more on the governance question. So we've created a quite large corporate climate governance advisory facility. So we help, whether it's an FI or a corporate or even a municipality, we can engage them very directly to help them come up with their specific decarbonization plan or transition plan in that case, where then all the different components, whether it's lack of access to finance or whether it's regulatory requirements that still need to be achieved, that can all be included in these kind of planning exercise. So we're trying to help with that in the scope of what I said earlier about focusing more on the counterparty than sort of only the specific funding. And I think the main thing that I see in the day-to-day is that still there's a very different levels of awareness, but also preparedness, really, for dealing with climate risks, for dealing with sustainability risks, for dealing with social risks, and let alone the more complicated areas of nature-related. Climate is already quite well understood, but nature still, it's very difficult for many companies, and especially in the SME sector, to really identify, manage it, and so on. So we're trying on all these levels to provide tools and preparedness and awareness and capacity building, and then of course the concrete funding. Because you're right, the person is at the center of all of this, but we do know that the sustainability transformation requires huge amounts of funding. So without the billions, unfortunately, it also won't work.
Okay. So let me take it back to the Greek level. So Konstantina, we heard that policy reforms are necessary. We talked a lot about the global context. Can you share with us some of the policy reforms that are happening in Greece in order to be able to kind of advance also the regulatory context at the local level to be able to be more advantageous to companies?
Well, Marina, the reform is a work in progress. I would rather refer to the challenges in this road, I'm afraid.
It's always a progress.
I'm afraid. Well, you know better than me that the first step is always the scientific work. the environmental priorities in Greece cannot be the same as elsewhere in Europe, even in neighboring countries. And I'm saying you know better than me. The islands are a differentiating factor by themselves, if nothing else is factored in, it's just the islands. However, on a national level, there is a momentum. There is a momentum. There has been work done by the Ministry of Energy and Environment, by other stakeholders and NGOs as well. And there is also a public acceptability. We have reached that point due to the unfortunate and extreme weather circumstances and the effects, the devastating effects they had on people. But it had this outcome that we have reached a level of public acceptance, which is always critical when it comes to reforms, especially to tax reforms. The challenges. The first challenge is that, and it will sound strange, when we are taxing fossil fuels, for as long as people are still using them, the public revenue is high. When the measure turns out to be successful and people stop using fossil fuels, the public revenue reduces drastically. So it's another gap, another element that has to be tackled. So this would be challenge number one. Challenge number two would be, we talked about modeling work and anticipating the future in terms of econometrics. We do have quality data, I'd like to think, on carbon emissions, on a number of factors, but when it comes to biodiversity or circular economy, modeling work becomes extremely difficult and challenging. So this would be the second challenge. And challenge number three, we need quality data on a number of items, and we need to make sure that they are up to date, so we don't create unintended consequences in other areas based on what we knew 5 years ago. If we design the measure now based on what we knew 5 years ago, there might be unintended consequences that we could not imagine them. On the positive side, we've heard in the previous panel about the double materiality. There is a new concept, and I'm sure you're familiar with the so-called double or triple dividend. So it's not about reducing the emissions, to mention an example. It has also to do with, at the same time, shifting the economic activity elsewhere so that employment, for example, or household income are not affected. But also, it might be critical in terms of public revenue as well, this same measure to be adopted.
So every policy measure has both intended and unintended consequences, and you opened the important door for me to do a sequitur to Sylvie, because even the climate challenge, by the time we understand one element, we've moved to another layer that adds more complexity, which from the point of view of many companies, this sometimes looks like a moving target. So you're also co-chair of, let's say, I would call it, I don't know, correct me, civil society initiative, the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. So what are the expectations? Like, you've been a regulator, an elected official. What can we expect from the private sector? And what kind of guidance can we provide so that we have one reference, particularly for the biodiversity markets, which is complicated to quantify, right, as a financial risk and all of that?
Now, very briefly, because we are running out of time, it's an initiative taken by the British government and the French government. You can call them civil society, but we have in the panel many representatives of local communities, indigenous people, finance sector, etc. And we are aiming at creating new financial instruments to draw some, to channel some capitals from the private sector to the nature conservation and restoration. But what I would like to say is that the funny thing when you deal with nature is that you have always people saying, you know what, climate is simple, climate is under control. So I take the point. I think it's not that easy, and I really would like you to keep one message. It's not that someone perverse is adding nature to something that is complicated enough and was climate. No, we sliced something the scientists consider one topic. And the one topic is how can we make sure that our production, our mobility, human activity is not going to harm the planet. And it includes the two. So to a certain extent, it can look more complex, but it is not, because if you take into account the trade-offs since the beginning, first, you are going to have better policies. Second, the same people in the board or in the legal department or wherever in your company, the same people can deal with both at the same time. We are going to have the data, and if I may, don't wait until you have the perfect data to act, because if you wait until we have perfect data, we will not be able to tackle the issue. So do whatever you can, and do it again. It's the play it again Sam logic. So we will all make mistakes, of course. We will all have to pilot and to exchange experiences, and that's the reason why it will be a fantastic topic for Delphi next year.
Well, okay. This is an invitation to be extended to us to continue the dialogue. Before we run completely out of time, I leave the last word to Leonidas. So again, you heard that the task is one challenge, not multiple challenges. But I'd like to hear your perspective, because you also have to run a business and you have jobs that you have to maintain. So therefore, you have to keep making profit and maintain a sort of a business continuity scenario. How do you manage to do that and to, let's say, slice the climate challenge with the biodiversity, with the nature assets management, et cetera, so that it's manageable and you can keep also your compliance as well as your strategic opportunities for the future?
Yeah, I'll be very brief because we're done. I think there are a number of things that go into this. Of course, data is important. Without needing perfect data to act, we try to act with whatever we have, but at the same time we try to build our data to make the right decisions. And these decisions have to be based on economic analysis. So everything we do, whether it's about nature or the climate, it has to generate value for the company and for all its stakeholders at the same time. Of course, we need long-term planning in order to be able to achieve all of that. We need to integrate it into the strategy of the company. We need the right governance mechanism, starting from the board of directors all the way down to every single employee in the organization to make this work. Collaboration is key. We're out of time. I just want to mention that, of course, whatever we do within our companies, within our sectors in Europe is definitely not enough. It's a drop in the ocean unless we can really put the entire world in this, collaborate, have a level playing field so that we do not lead to deindustrialization of Europe, but actually a decarbonization that will help the planet along with all of our efforts in nature-based solutions.
Thank you. I think that was a very positive message. Thank you to all our panelists for having come from far and not so far to be with us today. And I'd like to abuse my position on the podium to thank the companies who are helping us at CGI. Titana's one of them. So thank you for collaborating. Have a good day.